A little bit of information about the Summit for Religious Freedom, or SRF, or we call it SURF. It is the hub for our collective fight for religious freedom, church-state separation, and the issues that depend on them, like LGBTQ rights, abortion and reproductive rights, protecting public schools, democracy, and more. SURF is convened by Americans United for Separation of Church and State in collaboration with our partners. Last year's SURF had almost 50 organizational partners. Virtual events like these webinars ensure the learning, conversation, and networking at SURF continue year-round. We call this continuous programming SURF 365. In the future, these SURF 365 virtual events will only be available to Summit attendees, but we're excited to make them available to all in this first year. Please visit thesurf.org, that's the SRF.org, for more details. And as a reminder, the in-person program of SURF is augmented by a smaller online SURF that folks can attend, because we know not everybody can travel to conferences. All registrants of this webinar will receive an email tomorrow with a link to this recording. I'd now like to introduce our participating organizations tonight. First Americans United, or AU, is the only organization dedicated solely to defending the separation of church and state. We are the shield protecting the foundational American principle of freedom of religion, including the right to believe or not believe for all. Equality Florida is Florida's statewide civil rights organization dedicated to securing full equality for Florida's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community. And those two organizations are proudly represented tonight by our two panelists, who I'm going to invite to join us on video now. Brandon Wolf is a nationally recognized gun safety and LGBTQ civil rights advocate and a personal friend who found his passion for social change after surviving the shooting at Pulse nightclub. He's contributed opinion columns in USA Today, CNN, and Newsweek, and appears regularly on television outlets such as MSNBC, CNN, and more. He's currently press secretary for Equality Florida, and as you're about to learn tonight, a tremendous author. Andrew L. Seidel is an attorney and author of two books, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism Is Un-American, and his second book, American Crusade, How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom. He's also my colleague as AU's Vice President of Strategic Communications. Andrew and Brandon, thank you so much for being here on behalf of everyone. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. And Brandon, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm really excited about this.
I'm thrilled. Thank you for inviting me, truly.
I mean, I would have it no other way. This is actually our second book talk, some people may not know. The first was about a book by some lawyer hack who was complaining about the Supreme Court. But you have written a remarkable, brave memoir that I really hope everybody watching this reads. It feels like you bared and shared everything from growing up as both a multiracial and LGBTQ kid in rural Oregon to your most vivid memories of the attack on Pulse. And you really transport the reader into your life. And the first thing I want us to talk about is you write about your early activism in the book in high school, when you were in student government, and how you ran into some serious opposition for Diversity Week, from the Fellowship of Christian Athletes to there were flyers reading, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Basically, people citing religion and religious freedom, something we often see in opposition to LGBTQ equality. And this can get really serious. I mean, we learned earlier this week that Lori Carlton, the shop owner who flew that pride flag, was murdered by a Christian nationalist. So how do you see the connection between church-state separation and the fight for LGBTQ equality and rights?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for laying it all out like that. It's funny you use the word activism to talk about my high school experience. I feel so odd about that word, because for me, activism is survival, right? And I think for a lot of marginalized people, that is what activism is at its core. We're fighting for our very survival. We're fighting for basic human rights. We're fighting to be treated with dignity and respect. We're fighting for the right to love who we love and raise families and be productive members of society without fearing discrimination and violence simply because of who we are. So there were certainly moments of activism as a young person, but I think even then, I identified that what I was doing was fighting for my own survival and fighting for the survival of students around me. For me, the fight for, the separation of church and state and the fight for LGBTQ civil rights are grounded in the same thing, and that is freedom. You touched on it. We obviously, it's above your head. We're talking about religious freedom, and that means the freedom to believe or not believe, no matter who you are. And I think the fight for LGBTQ civil rights is in many ways a piece of that same puzzle, right? That on one hand, you have a group of people, Christian nationalists, who don't fundamentally believe in freedom. They don't believe in democracy. They see it as an obstacle to overcome, a hurdle to scoop to the side to try to get to their intended outcome, which is ultimate power and control over everyone. They don't believe in freedom as an unconditional value worth defending. They believe it's conditional. They believe that freedom should be afforded to only those who agree to live their lives as they've been instructed by Christian nationalists who believe their worldview is superior to others. And then on the other hand, you have people like us who are fighting for, the separation of church and state, who are fighting for LGBTQ civil rights. You have people in the, broader civil rights movement who are fighting for racial justice, who are fighting for criminal justice reform, people who are fighting for abortion rights. All of that is grounded in a fundamental belief that freedom should be an unconditional value afforded to everyone, simply on the basis of you being a human being, that I do not have the right to impose my value set on you because we disagree on something or because you believe in a higher power that I don't believe in. There's sort of this dichotomy, this fight over who really gets access to freedom and when and where. And that really showed up for me, as you mentioned, in high school, when we had this group of students who, didn't believe that kids like me should have the freedom to speak our minds. They, during diversity week, didn't believe that kids like me should be represented in the posters on the wall. They didn't believe that, something that said love is love was appropriate for school because it ran contrary to their values. And by the way, those are the same students who also had lots of racist and inappropriate things to say about immigrant populations, had lots of racist and inappropriate things to say about Black folks in the school. And so again, I think it's all rooted in this struggle over the word freedom. What does it really mean? Is it a value worth defending? Should it be unconditional? And you have two very starkly different views on that. And that is the fundamental struggle, not just the one that I was having in high school, but I think the one we're having across the country today.
I think that's right. It's the freedom for me, but not for thee kind of attitude. And right. I'm so glad you pulled on the democracy thread, because that really does underlie a lot of the work that we are all doing. I mean, Rachel Lazar, CEO of and president of Americans United, likes to say that the end point of white Christian nationalism is the toppling of democracy. And I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things that struck me about your book, about your life, was a phrase that I heard at the Summit for Religious Freedom a few months ago. Kiara Johnson, who runs the National LGBTQ Task Force, was giving a keynote, and she talked about threats to the binary. And as I read your book and the story growing up, I reflected on that phrase, because you are a challenge to the binary too. And you're actually pretty clear about this in the book. You write, "My family story was too complicated for a world reliant on binary labels." Right. And this memoir that you wrote, it's not just about an LGBTQ kid finding his way in America, but also about a multiracial kid finding his way in this country, who's too Black for some and too white for others. And I mean, is your story and the story that you tell in A Place for Us, is it really this intersectional challenge to the binary? And what does that mean?
Yeah, I think the word intersectionality, like so many other phrases, has been hijacked, quite frankly, by the right wing. I think it's been, bastardized and politicized to a point where saying intersectionality out loud feels like you're talking about some political battle over curriculum and not an actual term that describes people's lived experiences. In fact, you have people like my own governor, Ron DeSantis, who will talk about intersectionality in a purely political sense without acknowledging that there are intersectional people, by the way, who live in Florida, right? There are intersectional constituents that make up the body politic. And so part of what I wanted to explore in A Place for Us is, what does intersectionality really mean? And what does it feel like? What does it look like? What does it smell like and sound like in our communities? What is it like to be an intersectional person in society? What is it like to have to, as a 15 or 16-year-old kid, grapple with both homophobia and racism happening at the same time, often coming from the very same people? What does it feel like? You think about kids who experience racism at school and in the neighborhood. a lot of times those kids can go home and they see faces that look like theirs, and home becomes a safe space for them, where there's a church or gathering space that is a safe space for them, right? But for me, living at the intersections of being a queer person, the only queer person in my family, and the only Black face around the dinner table, I didn't get that, privilege of having a safe space anywhere in society. Everywhere was a threat to me. And so I carved it out in places like, my friend's kitchen island, huddling around on the floor. We, snuck out to gay bars before we were even old enough to have fake IDs. We did those things because the places that were safe for other kids, maybe not experiencing the same intersections as us, those spaces weren't safe for us. So in many ways, I think a place for us was intended to be an exploration of intersectionality as a real human condition, not as a political term, not as some sanitized theory, but as, a lived experience. What do those harms look like? What do they feel like? And also, what is the power of that intersectional story, right? Because it's not just about the forms of oppression that I experienced as a young person. It's also about me unlocking my greatest superpower, which is that I'm the only one who can tell my story. I'm the only one who knows what it feels like to move through the world as me. And being intersectional is a part of that, right? And so I think part of the book is also about empowering people living at those intersections, letting them know that their stories are a superpower. Again, they're not some sanitized theory or political term. They're real lived experiences that the world needs in order to be complete. And just to sort of put a bow on that, what I love about what you said is this idea of life outside the binary. And I think when we talk about Christian nationalism, we talk about the fight for freedom. Part of what Christian nationalists are so afraid of about the LGBTQ community is that we don't live inside the confines of their constructed binary, right? And that is terrifying to them because it means it's a threat to their power structure entirely. It means it's a threat to their intended outcome for the world, this installation of theocracy where we all live by the same rules, where girls wear pink and boys wear blue, and one group likes trucks and the others likes Barbies. We fly in the face of that, and we've found joy and resistance. We're thriving outside the confines of that binary, and I think that very existence as intersectional people, as people who live outside these binary constructs, I think that poses a threat in their eyes, and that's part of why they resist our existence so fiercely.
Yeah, I think your existence is a threat, which is, I think a lot of what we're running up against right now. They perceive it as a threat. It is not a threat, but they perceive it that way. And I want to touch on something else. I want to pull on that safe space thread, because that's another one of those sort of phrases that's been corrupted and perverted and destroyed. And as you were talking,
I have a story about that, by the way. I'll work it into my answer.
Okay, well, and as you were talking about that, the Orwell from 1984, it's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words, like popped into my head. But another major theme of your memoir is community, and finding community and building community. And you even write in there a couple of different times that community saved your life, and that you mean that literally. And that's part of the work that you do now. So to tell us about why community is so important.
Yeah, well, first I want to touch on safe space. So for those, I'll pull you into the palace intrigue folks on the line about what it's like to write a book. And one of the things that you discover very early on is there's this give and take with a publisher, right? The publisher wants a certain outcome. They want to sell books. They have invested in your project, and so they want to make sure that it does well. And you're the author, so you have some, creative interest in the things that are written on the page or, printed onto the cover. This book, for most of its existence, had a working title of Safe Space, and I was very attached to that term. I was very attached to that as the idea. When I wrote the proposal for the book in the summer of 2020, I knew that's what I wanted it to be called. And I remember distinctly, I was keynoting the Netroots Nation conference in Pittsburgh when I got a call from my publisher, and they said, we need to talk about the title. And it was this 90-minute grieving process over losing Safe Space. We ultimately came to a place for us, which I actually think is perfect for the story. I think it ended up working out maybe even better than Safe Space would have. But the reason they brought to me the challenge to the title was exactly what you're talking about. They said, Safe Space is is politically charged. It's been hijacked. And there's a real possibility that people will see the name of that on the shelf and not pick it up because they won't think that it's relevant to them or their lived experience. And A Place for Us was enough different that they were willing to go there and welcome people in with that title.
Did part of you like want to hold on to it more because of that? You're like,
absolutely.
Well,
oh, yes. Yeah. You can imagine that the discussion that ensued on this call was like, I think that's a great thing. I think we should totally do that. And, the publisher's like, well, we need to sell books. So I love your passion, but let's find a way to sell books at the same time. But while the term safe space has been hijacked and has become, almost like a jab at people who need to seek safety in the world, it really means something, especially to queer people. And it especially meant something to me. Someone, as I mentioned, who as a kid didn't really have a lot of safe spaces. Home was not safe for me all the time. School was certainly not safe for me all the time. Church was absolutely not safe for me. I'm happy to talk about that if we want to go into that on this call too. But there was not a lot of safety in my life. And the safe spaces that I had were not always physical. They were the relationships that I built with other people. I talked about huddling around the kitchen island in my best friend's home when I was in high school. That was a safe space for me and a community that probably saved my life at a time where I wasn't sure if wandering the halls of school was worth it anymore, where I questioned whether being on planet Earth was worth it anymore. That sense of safety and community and belonging saved my life. And then I think about how, I moved 3,000 miles from home with nothing but 2 suitcases, and Orlando as a community saved my life. It was, the other queer people of color that I met, perhaps for the first time, ever seeing faces that looked like mine, that gave me a reason to believe that I belong in the world, that the world is big enough for someone like me. And then, of course, in the wake of the tragedy at Pulse nightclub, community saved my life again. I lost my best friends, my chosen family that day. And there were some dark moments where I wondered again if the next day was really worth seeing anymore. And it was the unconditional, passionate love of this community, the woman who hugged me in line at Publix, the grocery store, without knowing who I was or my story, because she could see I was in pain. It was the woman who offered me a shoulder at a vigil because she could see that I was grieving the loss of my loved ones. It's the people who came and cooked dinner for me or did the laundry or washed dishes in the weeks that followed so that I could just focus on healing. That community saved my life. And I think that it's a testament to the kind of community we need right now. We need that community for each other, for ourselves. I'm a firm believer that self-care is not an individual activity. It's a team sport. It is community care. It's about caring for one another. And at a time when we're so divided and so polarized, and we've been through so much, we've been through, a global pandemic, we've been through political strife, we've been through an insurrection on the US Capitol, democracy hanging on the edge. In the midst of all those things, the thing that will save us, the thing that will save our lives and our society, I think, is community. It's each other.
And you do write about it a lot in relation to community, a lot in relation to the attack on Pulse, because this wasn't just a mass shooting. I mean, that'd be horrific enough. This was an attack on that community that saved your life. It was an attempt to destroy that community. It was your existence being a threat to this person. And you wrote in the book that Pulse felt like home to you. Will you tell us about the attack?
Yeah. It's, again, I'll pull you into the palace intrigue for a moment, but another part of the process of writing a book is selling a book, right? You, of course, write a proposal and you start jotting down your ideas, and as the author, it's the greatest book that's ever going to be written and everybody should read it. But then you have publishers who, they don't know you, they don't know your work specifically, they know bits and pieces of your story, what you're willing to share, but they want you to tell them, why is this the greatest book that's ever written, and why are so many people going to want to read it? At every stop in the interview process, when I was selling this proposal, publishers asked the same question. And that was, is this a book about Pulse? And if it's a book about Pulse, something you've talked about so many times before, why does it need to be a book? Why can't it be an essay? Why can't it be an article? Why can't it be a series of interviews like you've already done? Why a book? Why so many words to cover something you've talked about so often before? And my answer to them was, It's kind of a book about Pulse. Pulse is actually only one chapter of 10 in this book, but I think it is more so a book about why Pulse mattered, because I don't think you can understand why Pulse, the event, hit people so hard, why it carried the weight that it carried, if you don't understand why Pulse, the space, mattered so much in the first place, and why spaces like Pulse exist around the country and around the globe. Pulse was a safe space for me and so many other people. It's one of the first places I ever held hands with someone I had a crush on without looking over my shoulder first. It's one of the first places I ever wore my, skinniest pair of jeans without being afraid of what someone would call me. It was a place where people could be whoever they wanted to be, dance however they wanted to dance, love whoever they wanted to love, and not be afraid of violence, discrimination, or worse. Everything about June 11th of 2016, the night before the shooting, was normal for me. It was a Saturday, which meant, it was laundry day. I was folding socks and underwear on the couch. My best friends, Drew and Juan, were on a date at SeaWorld. I was nursing a champagne hangover. There's a lot of drinking in this book. I apologize in advance. I really don't drink that much anymore. But I was nursing a champagne hangover. Somehow they looked flawless, which is unfair, but seemingly that was our standard existence. It was a summer day, so I spent time by the pool. I fell asleep in a lounge chair and sun went down for a while. And then when it came time to decide what to do for the night, I did the most normal thing. I texted my best friends and asked if they wanted to get a drink. They got to my apartment, just before midnight, just kind of late for us. We listened to the same playlist we always listened to, watched the same music videos we always watched. I was almost never allowed to have control of the cocktail shaker because I make drinks like 2 or 3 times as strong as they're supposed to be. I'm like trying to get to the, drunk part and skip all the rest in between. But for some reason, I think Drew could see that I was struggling that day. And so he relinquished and just would grimace at me from across the room every time he took a drink. And then when we decided to go out, we just picked the place that was a safe space for us. We picked somewhere we'd been hundreds of times before, and everything about Pulse was normal that night. It was, Saturday night, it was Latin night. The music was as loud as it ever was. There was this salty drag queen that would snatch your $5 at the front door, and she snatched my $5 that night. We, made our way through the beaded doorway and into the bar. We went to the same bartender we always went to, ordered the same nasty vodka sodas we always ordered. And we had a spot on the patio where when we'd had a drink or two, we'd go out and talk about life. My best friend Drew had a master's degree in clinical psychology. And, when he'd had a cocktail or two, he would offer a free therapy session for you, whether you wanted it or not. And so that night he had a free therapy session. He talked about love and friendship. And when he was, coming in for a landing on his point, he would drape an arm around your shoulder and pull you in real close. And he pulled me in that night and he said, what I wish we did more often is tell each other that we love each other. It was not long after that the most normal night of my life became the tragedy that people know it to be today. I was washing my hands at a bathroom sink. I can remember, for some reason, the poster on the wall above the urinal. I can remember the plastic cup sitting on the edge of the sink. I can remember how cold the water was from the faucet. And I can remember the first sound of gunshots, the hair standing up on the back of my neck, the dozen faces that rushed in the bathroom looking for safety and refuge, looking like they'd seen the purest form of evil. I remember the girl behind me huddled against the wall, trying so hard not to scream that I could feel her vibrating on the tiles underneath us. I remember locking arms with that dozen people making a break for an exit. I remember wishing I got a chance to say goodbye to my parents because I was convinced that I was never going to get an opportunity to talk to them again. I remember just this relentless gunfire in the air, the boom, 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 like it was exploding out of my chest. And then I remember the door flinging open, a door that I actually didn't know existed until that very moment. I remember the night air. I remember people running and screaming. There was a lot of blood. There was still this gunfire in the background, but I did feel a sense of relief because, I'd done the impossible. I had survived. And I remember how fleeting that sense of relief was when I realized that my best friends, Drew and Juan, my chosen family, had been wrapped in each other's arms underneath their favorite disco ball in the middle of the dance floor, enjoying one last dance right in that man's line of fire. So, as you know, in the early hours of June 12, 2016, in my neighborhood bar, in my safe space, a man filled with hate and armed with a weapon of war charged through the front doors. He fired over 110 rounds from a Sig Sauer MCX assault rifle into the crowded nightclub, and he killed 49 mostly LGBTQ people of color and injured 53 others. That tragedy, although one chapter in my book, is the thing that has propelled me to do everything. In the wake, I left my career, took a new job. I've been an advocate ever since. And my goal really is to ensure that other communities don't ever have to live that horror.
And you write about the difficulty of recovering from that trauma, of being robbed of Drew and Juan. And you write this beautiful story about the first time you laughed. And you write, up to that point, Joy had invoked a deep sense of guilt. And the story of that laugh was unexpectedly, for me, one of my favorite parts of the book. I wonder if you can tell us just a little bit about that small moment.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I discovered my love of international travel shortly after the shooting at Pulse. And I think part of what I wanted to do is, so much about the grief and pain that I had experienced was public. I was grieving my friends in public. I was grappling with PTSD and trauma in public. People immediately wanted perspectives on gun violence and LGBTQ issues. And the shooting happened in the middle of a presidential election cycle. And so there was this added political component to everything that was happening. And I fell in love with international travel because it allowed me a place to be anonymous. I didn't have to talk about anything. I didn't have to talk about gun violence. I didn't have to talk about Pulse. I didn't have to talk about the horror of losing my best friends. I could just melt into a community, oftentimes whose language I didn't speak, whose cultures I didn't fully understand, but I was a sponge for. And so there was this moment in 2017 where I write about going to Paris. And I had been sitting at work, the doldrums, I was like in a Starbucks cafe in North Tallahassee, Florida, if that tells you what I was experiencing that day. And I was having wanderlust and thinking about how desperately I wanted to get away to a place where I could be anonymous. And so I was browsing, I think Kayak or Google Flights or whatever, and I found this cheap ticket to Paris. And I thought, that's what I need. I need to go away. I need to pack a couple of suitcases and just go somewhere I've never been before. I had taken some French in high school and college, so I felt pretty confident that I could, maneuver the streets of Paris on my own. I'll assuage any concerns. A lot of people speak English in Paris, so you'll be okay if you don't speak French.
do. They really do.
But I was ready. I was ready for my baguette moment, my beret moment. I was going to ride bicycles by the Eiffel Tower. I had it all, envisioned in my head. And I got there, and, as I talk about, even up until that moment, even though I was imagining this joyful experience, this, this experience of relief, I still hadn't really given myself very much permission to experience those things yet. I hadn't told myself it was okay to feel relief, to feel hope, to feel happiness, to feel joy. I had laughed, but nothing really stood out to me as a moment that had really turned the tide, where I felt like I deserved to be happy again. And so I tell this, I think beautiful story of wandering down the streets of Paris, and this woman was just so happy. She was this older woman who was happy to be alive. And she saw a piece of trash on the sidewalk, picked it up and tossed it into a wastebasket near her. And we had this moment, this exchange where she, said good morning to me in French, and I accidentally responded in half English, half French, broken, whatever. And she giggled, and I laughed. For the first time in a very long time, I laughed, and my shoulders relaxed, and I could feel tears welling up in my eyes. And it was not because, again, it was the first time I had laughed since Pulse, but I think it was the first time I gave myself permission to laugh. I gave myself permission to exhale, to take the weight of the world off my shoulders. And it began a journey toward forgiving myself for being here. It began a journey toward giving myself permission to experience joy and happiness and love and friendship all over again, something that I really hadn't allowed myself to do since the tragedy.
And I mean, that's not the only story of healing in the book. You write a lot about your relationship with your dad, which did some things to me and had me in tears. But if you want to hear all about that, folks, you're going to have to buy the book and read it. The link is being shared in the chat. It's also available at fine bookstores everywhere. And if you have questions yourself, ask them in the Q&A slot. I'm going to get to some of those in a minute. I've got a couple more that I want to get through. And one of them is, I mean, this is a memoir. This is your story about your life. But I got the feeling reading it many times that it's not for you. So who did you write this book for?
I really wrote this book for everyone. And that sounds cliche to say. I feel like every author is going to say that because they want you to go out and read the book. There are a few, really specific folks that I wrote it for. Number one, I wrote it for my best friend. I wrote it in honor of my best friend. When you lose someone you love, there's a lot of emotion that you go through. And one of the most intense emotions I experienced was fear. I was afraid that I would forget him. So I saved old t-shirts to remember what he smelled like. I saved old voicemails so I could remember what he sounded like. And I was afraid the world would never get to know him. And so I wanted to write a book that kept the best parts of Drew alive. So that's first and foremost. I wrote the book in honor of my best friend. And I hope that, I hope that he would be proud of how it turned out. I also wrote this book for people inside the LGBTQ community and really specifically for young queer kids of color. I wanted them to see their lives and stories reflected back at them. I wanted them to know that the world is big enough for them, that there is a place for them in this world, that they're perfect exactly as they are, that they don't have to pack 2 suitcases and move 3,000 miles away in search of a place to be comfortable being themselves, because we're fighting to ensure that every single place is a place where they can be comfortable being themselves. And lastly, I wrote the book for people who may not have ever heard a story like it before. One of the most beautiful reviews that I got on Amazon, you said earlier, I probably shouldn't read the reviews, and that's true.
Not too closely.
I probably shouldn't read the reviews, but one of my favorite reviews that I read on Amazon was this person who said, I don't usually read memoir, but I was drawn to your book. I don't know why. Perhaps it's because I'm the mother of a trans child whom I'm struggling to accept and understand. Wow. And so I, in part, also wrote the book for people like that, people like my dad, who've always struggled to understand, those who are different from them, people who may be in the throes of Christian nationalist propaganda, that they may believe that there are communities like mine that are beneath them out there in the world. I wanted to give them a sliver, just a window into a lived experience that they might not normally stumble into, and invite them, if for just a moment, in the quiet privacy of their home, to wonder aloud if the world is big enough for all of us. So I think the book really is written for everyone, but first and foremost, I dedicated it to Drew, and then I hope that it serves as both a mirror and a window into the world.
As you're answering that, I'm wondering, did you have that as a kid? Was there a book that let you know that you weren't alone? And as you're thinking about that, since we didn't, I got to believe that is part of the goal of the book bannings that we're seeing across the country, right? To isolate and alienate kids where they could otherwise feel that they weren't alone. Banning these I don't even know how to describe the books, these perfectly normal and excellent books. Do you get that sense? And did you have a book like that when you were younger?
I wish I had a book like that when I was younger. I spent most of my childhood not knowing if anyone was like me in the world. And I think that's true for a lot of LGBTQ kids, especially LGBTQ kids of color. I talk about, what it was like to grow up in a majority white town, in a very conservative majority white town. And there are kids like that across the country right now, experiencing that very same sense of isolation. Obviously, it's a little different. I'm not going to age myself. I won't tell people how old I am. My birthday was last week or the week before. We'll just say 25 forever. But, I think times are different now. We obviously have access to the internet. Kids have access to TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and, YouTube, and they can see a world outside that reflects them, that's bigger than the one that they may see in the halls of their school. I think that's a positive development. I think social media is not always positive, but in that way it is positive. It gives people access to worlds they may not have imagined possible before. So again, I wish I'd had access to things like that on the internet when I was a kid. I wish I'd had access to books like that. I did read a book before writing my own that helped to I think, give me the power to be able to write my own story and believe that people would read it. And that is How We Fight for Our Lives by Said Jones. It's another memoir by a queer Black author. Said is an incredible, it's almost poetry in the form of prose, to be honest. I think it's just beautifully written. But he talks about growing up in the South as a Black man and also as a queer person. And that book really helped me to understand that my story carried weight. And to your other bigger point about book banning, I do think that experience I had with Said's book is really indicative of the fight around books and information in general, and why the right wing, why Christian nationalists work so hard to censor and stifle that kind of information. Because I say that storytelling, that stories are the language of freedom, that our stories not only help us to, get to know somebody new, they help open our hearts and minds to different perspectives and lived experiences. They help expand our capacity for imagination, but they also help us to build solidarity and community, right? There's a kid out there who, before reading someone like Said's book, or All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson, or A Place for Us by me, before reading those books, may not really realize that queer Black culture is out there for them, that there are people just like them across the country and across the world. And a book like that, a story like those, is the conduit for them to community, to solidarity. It helps them find other people with similar identities. It helps them find collective power in those communities. It helps people access their fight for liberation once they can see how these systems of oppression are impacting people that are not just themselves. And I think ultimately storytelling is the bedrock of progress, right? We don't get to a place where we stop making the same mistakes over and over again if we don't learn how to share those mistakes with one another, right? We don't get to a place where we've moved society forward if we don't tell the story of where society came from. So again, I think, to your point, Christian nationalism hinges on censorship, on control of language and speech, on propaganda, because honest storytelling of varied different perspectives is the language of freedom, and it poses a threat to the Christian nationalist agenda.
Yeah, and to that pioneer. So we're gonna move to audience questions now, and they're coming in. Again, if you want to ask a question, go ahead and you can do that in the Q&A. I am going to reserve the last question as a point of privilege for myself as we're nearing the end. You probably know it's coming. I've asked it to you before, but I'm going to ask Alan's question first. Alan asked, "How do you not hate?" And then he adds a follow on me. What do you recommend that we do to confront Christian nationalism? So take those in whatever order you want. But how do you not hate, and what do you recommend we do to confront Christian nationalism?
Yeah, listen, hate for me is the easy answer, right? It's so easy in today's society when we live in these social media ecosystems where you log on and the only thing you read is that you're the smartest person on earth and everybody else is stupid. In that environment, it's easy to choose hate. It's easy to cast people aside. It's easy to hit the block button as soon as somebody's going back and forth with you in the comments section. It's easy to insulate ourselves into our little bubbles, because engaging with people is hard, right? Engaging with different worldviews and perspectives is very challenging. The reason that I choose to engage as often as I can, listen, first and foremost, I'm going to tell you, you have to protect your soul, right? You have to protect your time. You have to protect your well-being. If somebody's going in the Facebook comments that I've never met before, I don't know who they are, it's probably not the best use of my time to give them my thesis project on why their worldview is wrong. We probably won't get to the end result either one of us is looking for, because we're just arguing to argue. But I do think in a broader sense, engagement is necessary because we still have to live on planet Earth together. And when I get in those moments where it's tempting to choose hate, where I'm tempted to go the easy route and just cast somebody aside, I think about my dad. And I think about the relationship we've had over the years, that he's someone who has really struggled to understand me. He has really struggled to support and accept who I am. But he's come a long way, and it's because we never gave up on each other. It's because we chose love time and time again when hate and bitterness would have been the easier answer. Doesn't mean we always agree today. Doesn't mean I'm going to change his mind on everything, but I believe that our love as a family, our love as father and son, transcends our, desire to be right in those moments. And so, again, I think when it's easy to choose hate, I try to choose compassion and engagement, because at the end of the day, I still love people. I still believe that we are good to our core, and we have to work hard to care and be compassionate for one another. And then your second question is about how do we confront Christian nationalism? How do we challenge it head on? I think we have to do two things. First of all, we can't be afraid of our own shadow. I think very often Christian nationalists, the right wing, they're very good at simple, tactical, strategic messaging that tears at the fabric of everything we believe to be true. And they will take terms like freedom, hold them hostage, and claim to be the arbiters of them, and not allow you any space for nuance, right? It's like, all you hear from the right wing is that they are champions of freedom, when in reality, they're the ones who are working hard to curb people's freedoms every single day. And
Absolutely.
so 100%. And so number one, I think we have to call their bluff, right? I think we have to challenge them head on and say, actually, we're not going to cede the word freedom. What you're doing is not free at all. We're not going to, allow you to be racist or homophobic or transphobic and not use those words because we're afraid they might be incendiary. We're just going to say it like it is. Those things are deeply racist and homophobic and transphobic. We have to start by naming the harm and being honest about it. And then I think the second thing we have to do, that may be even more important, is not just tell people what we're fighting against, but give them a vision of what we're fighting for. So often we get stuck in defense. We're resisting, but we don't take the time to take a breath and share with people what the world might look like when we win. What does it look like when freedom really is an unconditional value that's afforded to everyone? What does it look like when people have the freedom to believe or not believe without government imposition or their neighbors, exercising these extremist laws against them? What does it look like to be able to read books and access healthcare and choose a college major without having to ask the government for permission first? What does that world actually look like? And why does it provide value for everyone, no matter where you are on the spectrum? I think doing the work of creating that vision of a world we're fighting for is probably just as important as being honest about what we're fighting against.
I think that's absolutely right. I certainly agree on the second point. At Americans United, we often say that we're fighting for freedom without favor and equality without exception. So, it's hard to sum up a vision of your fight in a few words, but I think that does a pretty good job. And to your first point, I could not agree more. It's one of the reasons that I left litigation, having these fights in courts, to have these fights in the court of public opinion, because I think it's so crucial that we challenge this disinformation really everywhere, and not just litigating it in the court. Really, it was, I've said it before, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case is one of the things that changed my mind so much on how we are litigating this fight. This was a case about a gay couple that was discriminated against by a bigoted business, and became a case about a poor, persecuted Christian artist that the big bad government was forcing to violate his religion, which nothing could have been further from the truth. And yet they were successful in perverting that narrative and making a case about that in the first place, or in the last place. Okay, we got a bunch of questions coming in, so
I'm long-winded. I promise I'll be short.
No, it's okay. So Lauren asks a fun short one. First, she says, "Happy belated birthday," and then she's asking, "Are there any mantras or words of wisdom that you say to yourself, especially when times are tough? And is there a story behind that phrase?"
Yes. So I told you one already, which is that self-care is not an individual sport, it's a team activity. Yeah. I hold that dear, and I challenge my colleagues and my friends to go on that journey with me. Don't ask me if I'm taking care of myself, if that is not an invitation to take something off my plate, so that I have space to take care of myself. And then the other thing I would say, while we're on the topic of when the going gets tough and how do you care for yourself, Audre Lorde has my favorite quote of all time, and that is that caring for myself is not selfish, it's self-preservation, and that in itself is an act of political warfare. The whole point of fighting for freedom and liberation is to be able to enjoy freedom and liberation. And so along the way, we have to choose oasis, right? We have to choose to experience joy. We have to choose to experience happiness and love. We have to dance, we have to sing, we have to laugh. We do all of those things. Even at Equality Florida, when sometimes it feels like the tunnel is very dark and the light is very, very far away, we still choose to experience those moments of joy and community and friendship and laughing and dancing, because that's the whole point. And that in itself, just us experiencing queer joy at the workplace is an act of political warfare in a state that tells us that queer people should not feel safe or welcome anywhere. Us experiencing safety and inclusion inside our workspace is an act of resistance. In a society that tells you you're only as valuable as what you can produce or how many hours you put in a day, taking a nap is an act of resistance. So I remind myself of Audre Lorde's words very often that taking care of myself is all about self-preservation.
So I really like that. So Jenny's got a question on sort of specifics. She's a mom of children who identify as part of the LGBTQIA community. And I think this is a perfect one for you because we didn't mention this in your introduction, but Brandon has testified before Congress, does a lot of important work trying to talk to government officials about these issues. And she's asking for advice for those of us who are on the ground, attending board meetings, advocating for the oppressed or underrepresented and targeted communities. What have you found when speaking to those officials who fall more in line with the Christian nationalist belief that really works, is what I think she's asking here.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think you have to temper your idea of what the word works means. You have to temper
temper expectations.
Success, because the truth is you're not going to walk into a state legislative hearing in Florida and talk to, someone like Randy Fine, who is a state representative who's led the charge on a lot of these things, and tell your story and he will suddenly decide to drop all the bills. There are far more powerful forces at work than that. I think you and I, Andrew, talked a lot about this when we were together before. There are huge organizations that have poured tens of millions of dollars into this agenda. It's not like they're going to jettison the bills or stop the attacks because somebody walks in and tells their story one time. But that doesn't mean that telling your story doesn't matter. So here's some of the things I would tell you I know work. Number one, sharing your story really does have an impact, especially behind closed doors. When you're sitting across the desk from somebody, there are lawmakers out there. Maybe they're fewer and far in between than they have been before, but there are lawmakers out there who are in the job because they actually care about the job. And for them, a personal story is going to be something that touches their heart. It may not change things tomorrow, but it might totally change their perspective down the road, and you may become someone that they can talk to on the issue. Number two is appeal to shared values. I think although we have not always, and maybe never as a country, afforded freedom as we think we should, people still hold freedom as a fundamental American value. You ask people what they think makes America great, many of them will talk about the word freedom. And that means that when you're showing up in those spaces, talking about freedom as a value is something that is shared among the room. You may not always agree on what freedom means or who it should be afforded to, but speaking a shared value language allows you to connect with people who may not normally agree with you and hopefully make some headway. And then the last piece I'll give you is about inspiring a bigger movement, because at the end of the day, part of changing politics is changing politicians. And the truth is we have a lot of changing politicians that has to happen across the country. There are a lot of people who stand to make a lot of money and be very famous because they have jumped on the Christian nationalist right-wing train, and they just have to go. They have to lose their jobs. They're in it for wealth, power, and fame. And if they don't believe those things are at risk because of the actions they're taking, if they don't believe they'll lose their jobs, then why would they change their behaviors? And so part of showing up to those hearings is not just about changing the mind of the lawmaker that's sitting across from you. It's about inspiring other people to show up, to share their stories, to get involved with organizations, to register to vote, and then to show up and make change at the ballot box as well. So being that person, showing that courage, you're probably inspiring someone else to show up the next time, and then they'll inspire someone else, and suddenly you've grown a movement.
I think that's great. Focusing on shared values, I think as you said, is crucial. Not always, but I often say that shared values matter more than shared beliefs. And that's something I really have been holding on to a lot in this sort of splintered and otherizing culture that we're in right now. And Jeremy, I'm going to give Jeremy the last sort of question here before I ask my final one, which is about that. How do you reach across the open versus closed-minded divide when you have one who believes that otherizing and dehumanizing are acceptable ways to engage with those with whom they disagree? So how do you deal with somebody who is dehumanizing, you in that way?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think what I've learned to be confident about is what I will tolerate and what I will not, and to be upfront about those things. And I think as a community, again, we've gotten better at this. Certainly the LGBTQ community has gotten really good at this over the last few years, as anti-LGBTQ rhetoric is on the rise and violence is on the rise. But I think, we have to be comfortable saying what we will and will not tolerate. We can have a good faith discussion about values. We can have a good faith discussion about politics, about policy. What we will not tolerate is the dehumanization of people that serve, a means basically, to usher in power and control over entire populations. We won't tolerate that. And so we set that as a line in the sand. And we say, again, we're willing to have a good faith conversation about politics, about policies, about politicians. But what we will not tolerate is being dehumanized or used as a scapegoat in a way that puts us in danger, that risks our freedom, our safety, our well-being, right? So that's number one, is just sort of, drawing a line in the sand. And then I also think it's about being clear on who the audience is at any given moment. I talked about, right, the person in the Facebook comments who I don't know and I've never met them before. They're probably not the audience that's going to receive my message in the best possible way. But there is someone in their life for whom that is the truth, right? My dad and I are that relationship. I am a trusted messenger for my dad to talk about things that he would not want to hear from MSNBC or CNN anchors, but he can hear it from me because we have a relationship built on trust. And so we're able to have these open dialogues. Oftentimes, I think that's where the open and closed comes from. Again, there are people out there who are out to harm other people, and we've got to be clear and draw that line in the sand and say, that's not something we're going to tolerate. But for all of us, we have relationships with people in the world that allows us to have conversations that they wouldn't normally be able to have with other people. We have to be able to put those relationships in front and center, right? We have to be able to lean into those relationships and have conversations with those people who have starkly different views from us, but believe in us and trust us. Trusted messengers, as much as shared values, are perhaps the most important thing as we think about having those conversations.
I think that's really insightful. And I'm going to bring Brian back on to wrap us up in a minute here. And I know there was a ton of questions I didn't get to, and
I'm so
Brandon
sorry.
and I are so very sorry about that. You can find him on social media and follow him, and you can ask there, and maybe he'll get to it. But I get to ask the last question. And as I read this beautiful book, which you all should read too, I noticed a lot of similarities between your background and President Barack Obama's. So when are you running for office?
Oh my gosh, you're not going to leave on that.
Yeah, that's what I want to know.
Okay. I am going to sound like a politician, which I absolutely do not mean to do. I don't want to sound cliche, but I will say this. Before Pulse, I was probably like a lot of people, title mattered a lot to me, and salary mattered a lot. And it was, all about climbing the ladder. I was working at a corporation. And so I was doing the things that had been ingrained in me by society. And Pulse changed all of that. Losing my chosen family, my brothers, changed how I see everything, how I move throughout the world. And so those things don't matter as much to me anymore. And what I've told people about the question you're asking, when are you going to run for office? My answer has always been, I will do whatever job is necessary and be wherever I have to be, so long as it has the greatest impact and moves us forward in the best way possible. So if I were called to serve, if there was a seat and it made sense for me to run, I would be honored to serve in that way. And I'm also honored and really humbled to do the job I do every single day, fighting for LGBTQ civil rights. I just want to be in the best place possible every time I can be to help move the ball forward.
And you do a remarkable job of it. The book is a place for us. Oh, my virtual background is messing with it. Everybody, please go get a copy. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us. This was really, really wonderful. Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you to wrap us up. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
So I'm actually going to bring one more, not question, but comment from the chat, because I think it's a good
Do
one
it.
to end on. This is from Gloria, and she said, really thank you. This is the most positive, uplifting session I've attended. Knowing that the Brandons of the world are working for true freedom and are young enough to see this, though, through really is encouraging. Thank you. So I think that's a great one to end on. I wanted to thank Brandon and to thank Andrew for being here. I'm really quickly going to put up on everybody's screen brandonwolf.us. You can go there. You'll see at the top a place for us. You can click on it. And that's a great place to go to order the book. You'll see the links right here from both Amazon and bookshop.org. And a tremendous amount of praise for the book. So we encourage folks to go and get a physical or digital copy, whatever you prefer, however you read your books. Again, thank you to our panelists. You'll be receiving a link to this recording tomorrow, as well as an opportunity to provide feedback. As a reminder, Surf 365 is our year-round programming connected to the Summit for Religious Freedom, SRF, pronounced SURF. SURF is both an in-person and virtual conference that will be occurring in the spring of next year. And we hope that you all can join us as we continue to expand it and bring all of these intersecting issues that are fueled by rising Christian nationalism together. They are different issues, but they are all connected by a common enemy. I think, what we saw today was all of the things that Christian nationalists are trying to do lead to, these really terrible results, including for the LGBTQ community. But there is hope, there is answers, there are things that we can do. The summit is one of them. Buying this book is another, and continuing to stay involved with your local organizations, your faith communities, your atheist and non-believer communities is a key part of that. So on behalf of everyone here at Americans United, all of the partner organizations at the Summit for Religious Freedom, thank you all for joining us, and have a good night.